You're listening in on an animated discussion about the new Batman adventures with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from the cinematropolis.com. And today's topic is The Demon Within. So Joshua, after finishing the Demon Within, I'm confident in saying this is the greatest Arthurian legend adaptation of the 90s. Now, that's not saying anything.
I agree.
That's not saying literally anything, because Arthurian legends are adaptations are generally very, very, very bad. But this is a pretty good one. I had fun with it.
Yeah, I think there are two things working for it in its favor from that perspective. And one is, yeah, the bar is extremely low for good Arthurian adaptations in the 90s. But the other one is, it's barely an Arthurian adaptation. Like, they just nod at it. But I think you've hinted at an observation that we're going to make in the future, which is when we get to more Arthurian adaptations in the DCAU, they're going to be the best ones of those for the 2000s too.
Yes, I will say that I'm very excited. So this is, of course, for listeners who have finished the episode, that it ends with the expectation that there might be more adventures with Etrigan and Jason Blood, and the ones we do later in Justice League are, in fact, awesome.
Speaking of Jason Blood and Etrigan, he is one half of our new designs for this episode, right? How do you feel about Jason Blood and his alter ego, Etrigan the Demon?
So much like the character himself, I'm very divided. So Jason Blood, so Joshua, I don't know if I've ever told you this, at least on the air. I got a sucker for the white streak of hair, the gray streak of hair.
Right,
I don't know.
right.
It just adds a texture and like, it makes him seem more sophisticated. I know that's cliche, but it looks right, especially with this character who's immortal. It looks right that he would have colored hair, except for like this one streak of gray or white. I think that's pretty cool. So Jason Blood, I think A+, kind of gives me some George Clooney vibes in a lot of ways. Versus Etrigan. Etrigan, I think the boots he wears I thought were pretty goofy, but overall, pretty cool. I will also say, context for listeners, my experience with these characters is, in fact, limited to the DCAU. I have probably read comics in which they pop up, but this is none dedicated to these particular characters, so I really don't have any sort of gauge on how this would compare to other versions, which, Joshua, has me asking you the question, can you give us a little more background and also your take on these designs? Absolutely,
I can. And as you will be unsurprised to discover, my experience with these characters is much deeper, and I have a lot of opinions. You know what's fascinating? You talk about that white streak as being like an addition of sort of dignity or gravitas, and I think that you are right with the ladies most of the time. I think that a lot of times with the men characters that do that, and we're not talking about like the graying wings at the temples, but like just a random white streak. And what I'm about to say is also true for some female characters. I can think of an X-Man especially, but I tend to think of that white stripe as I have seen some terrible stuff and it has marked me. And I think that is absolutely what Jack Kirby, the creator of Jason Blood and Etrigan the Demon, was going for. Of course, my X-Men reference for that is Rogue. Like, she's 13 or whatever in that first movie when she gets the white streak, but it's very much a I have seen some stuff, you know, kind of moment for her.
So Joshua, I'm really glad you mentioned the creator being Jack Kirby. I actually didn't realize that, but now that you say it, I'm like, oh, of course it's a Jack Kirby creation. That makes perfect sense.
It really does. If it's weird and you're like, how is this in the DC universe at all? The answer is probably Kirby. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. So a little background there. Jack Kirby did create Etrigan the Demon and Jason Blood, and their debut appearance was in The Demon, #1 in 1972. And so I guess my short version as far as comparing Kirby's vision with the DCAU version is that Jason Blood is pitch perfect. Pitch perfect. Like, distinguished. If I were casting an actual human, somebody in their 40s, you know, somebody with a little bit of weight and gravitas to them, but somebody who is still able to sort of be like action sorcerer, you know? So I think he's great. Jason Blood is basically exactly what I would have hoped for if you take a Kirby design and put it through the DCAU lens. I feel like Etrigan is good, but not great as far as that goes. And what I mean by that is it does look like him, right? I would see this design and instantly go, oh, it's Etrigan, obviously. But it does that Kirby through a DCAU lens in a way that just sort of winds up feeling kind of uninspired to me, I guess. Like, it's adequate. It does the job, but it just sort of gets you there and then drops you. And if I'm honest, I think I feel the same way about the voice acting and direction for Etrigan also.
Wait, but Joshua, the voice acting, I have to point this out. You feel like the voice acting is just flat? But Joshua, for one time only, Etrigan is voiced by the one, the only, the murderous, jealous fiance from Titanic, Billy Zane. And you think he's average? It's okay. I'm not a Billy Zane fan, but I just thought it was a nice note because some people know who he is. And in an alternate reality, I still think he'd make a good Lex Luthor, but that's beside the point.
Oh, that's an interesting take. That's very interesting. I don't actually hate this voice for Etrigan, and I actually have a softer spot for Billy Zane than you might think, because I will not defend the Phantom movie, but I will enjoy it and then not tell anybody that I did so. Except for all of you listeners. Welcome to my party.
Well, go watch The Phantom. That's what we're saying. Go watch The Phantom. It's great. I mean, it's not good. It's not good, Joshua, but I too will defend it with my honor. I would almost die on the hill of it's a super fun movie.
It's very enjoyable to watch and then instantly forget.
Yes.
That's probably the safest way. So it's not the voice itself. I think that voice could have been good, and maybe it's because Etrigan spends most of this episode kind of mind controlled and that they were telling him to play it kind of flat. I don't know. It just whines. I don't hate it. I don't want to sound too negative. It's fine. It does the job. It just doesn't really do the job to the point that my mind is blown. And this is my last note, and I recognize that it may be controversial even among fans of Etrigan, but he should rhyme more, a lot more. He should rhyme all the time and never stop rhyming, but we'll talk more about that in a minute.
Wait, is that a thing in the comics?
Absolutely. He is. Okay, I guess we'll do it now. So early on, Etrigan is promoted in hell. He's promoted, and part of your promotion is that you can become a rhyming demon, and then he only speaks in rhyme, and it is fantastic.
I don't want to get too off the beaten path here, Joshua, but getting promoted in hell, I really want to know what those titles look like. So is he like the rhyming demon? Is he like the rapper? Like, is his title at this promotion? Because of course hell has a very strict, probably business structure, reporting structure, org chart maybe. So what does this what does it look like to get promoted in hell? What do those titles look like? I am actually very morbidly curious, but apparently one of them is rhyming demon or rapping demon. I don't know.
So it's very not consistent. We'll just say it like that. At the top, you have Lucifer as sometimes the king of hell and sometimes not. It depends on which part of the DC publishing line you're reading, right? But you also have some dukes or archons of hell. What I can tell you is that there is a large cast of rhyming demons, and Etrigan is by far the most famous example of that. But his rhyming really comes and goes depending on who's writing him, because not every writer is able to do this well. And part of the doing it well is that it should never be very good. It should just be really striking. Like, it's doggerel that he's shooting from the hip with. And I like it, and I want it more. And we don't get it as much as I think we ought to get it. But that is a complaint that I have about Etrigan's appearances across every media, not just this one.
It's not consistent. Well, Joshua, we're going to get more into this here in a second, because here's my, I wouldn't say problem, observation about this episode that I find very strange. And I think it's going to take us right into the next character design we're going to be looking at. But this episode acts very matter of fact about both Jason Blood and Etrigan. Like, it's as if they've always been here the whole time, and they don't really explain anything. Actually, they just show up and happen to be friends with Bruce Wayne. A friendship, which, by the way, makes perfect sense. The dual identity thing. Yeah, totally. I'm on board. I'm cool with it. It just is really weird. But this episode does spend a lot of time setting up our next character design choice, which is Clarion the Witch Boy is it Tiki? Teakle?
Teakle. His familiar is named Teakle. Yes.
So what is your, I don't know much about this character other than that he looks creepy AF. What is your take on this design for Clarion the Witch Boy?
I have very similar feelings about Clarion as I do Etrigan when it comes to the adaptation. I love Clarion very, very much. He is just a magnificently awful character. Like the cliche of loving to hate a character was virtually tailored like a suit for Clarion the Witch Boy. You probably have more positive feelings about him from the Young Justice series, because he shows up in the much more recent Young Justice. In fact, the latest season of Young Justice is less than a year and a half old, I think, and is only created and available on the DC Universe platform. But Clarion showed up in one of the earlier seasons and is excellent. The voice acting, everything is great. So you're probably more familiar with that one. And this one is really just like a first draft for that one. And I mean on every level. I love Clarion, but this design basically is adequate. I really feel very similarly about it as I do Etrigan. Like it does look like Jack Kirby's, because this is also another Jack Kirby creation, and it does look very much like a Jack Kirby design through the DCAU lens. They nail that, but it doesn't elevate that. You know, it's sort of... We talked about this with the animated style before, that sometimes the stuff they do with the animated style, simplifying things, works spectacularly, and other times it leaves it looking kind of lackluster. I think the best lackluster examples are usually like the technology on Superman the Animated Series, Batman's own costume here on the new Batman Adventures, very flat, not very interesting. Sometimes it super works, like Batgirl, Robin's new outfit, you know. And with Clarion, I just feel like it winds up being the watered down version of Kirby's design. But I do appreciate that they keep some pretty puritanical touches, like the buckles on his boots, because that's some pretty integral stuff to the look of this character. Let me do the brief comic book history that I have for this, because both of these characters are just very old, much older than you might think. Well, not if you know about Kirby's career, but Clarion originally showed up in The Demon #7 in 1973, which is why we're getting him introduced here as kind of a foil for Etrigan, even though their paths diverge very quickly. Like once Kirby's done, they kind of go their separate ways and aren't really messing with each other as much. Clarion is from another dimension, the witch world, where dark sorcery is basically as ubiquitous as technology is to us. Like not everybody is a spellcaster in the same way that not everybody here is an engineer, but everybody knows how to use their iPhone. You know, but he's a child. And so he is often controlled and stopped from studying the kind of sorcery that he wants to study. So he runs away to Earth. And Tikal, his familiar, is his connection to Earth. It's the thing that keeps him grounded there and from snapping back to Witch World. So I love this entire concept. I love he's honestly, he is an ugly little troll I mean, he still looks like himself. Like he looks like a 10-year-old boy, but if you look in his face, he looks like a 10-year-old boy who is just not a good looking dude. And the relatively subtle, as far as Kirby counts for subtle, of turning his hair into devil horns. I love it. I love it. I love it so much.
It's his honestly his most striking feature, I would say, is the pointy hair. Which, by the way, who like, I don't care how much money this kid has. Maybe like the people who are running that auction should have been like, that kid looks creepy. Why does he have so much money? Why are we giving him? I mean, I know he's got money, but holy smokes, this is, you know, the thing about this, again, this episode, not necessarily a criticism. I just find it strange. Like they're walking out of this auction and Bruce Wayne is talking to Robin and very nonchalantly, or somebody, maybe it was Jason Blood, very nonchalantly is like, oh yeah, he turned his parents into mice. And that's and, and I was like, and it was just stating it like a very matter of fact, like everyone knew that was what happened. I'm like, why is this kid walking around in public? I'm very creeped out because he looks obviously creepy, clearly has sinister motives and is not trustworthy and has tons of money, which makes him very dangerous. It's really weird how the episode just, the whole world's happening around him and he just, I guess this is just Gotham City. I'll just attribute to that. This is just Gotham City. Yeah.
Here is the part that I love so much about the way they introduce these two characters. So what's interesting to me is that Clarion is treated like a brand new character that we have to be introduced to. And that is cool and accurate. Jason Blood is treated like a character we should already be familiar with, which is a wild choice, but also kind of cool because it lets them do stuff like that deal where Jason says to Bruce, yeah, that kid is a problem. He turned his parents into mice. And the thing that I love that they leave unsaid, but is such an easy, obvious jump in logic, is that he turned his parents into mice. And nobody says, hey, Jason, how come you didn't turn them back into humans? Because his familiar is a cat. That's why. There were no parents turned into mice left for him to turn back. You know, they're gone.
That is a very nice touch because I did. That
So
was kind
sinister.
of the it is, and because that was the implication I also took away from it was that his parents have been devoured by the cat. So, yes, good observation there. And you know, I think Joshua, what this makes me think about is, you know, origin stories can be a great thing. They can be a beautiful thing, and there's a lot of I think very powerful stories that people really connect with when you do origin stories. So I'm not anti-origin story. But I'll also say that when you don't have to worry about the origin story, you can just kind of have fun with the character. And they absolutely do that here, to your point.
And that's actually probably the thing I like most about this episode, because this is a really fun episode with a lot of really cool, like, mythology or world building stuff going on, right? I love all of that stuff, but it's kind of a fluffy episode. Like, not a lot, air quotes, happens. And I'm fine with this because my favorite thing about this episode is that it uses DC's deeper bench to suddenly just expand the universe in a way that is legitimately brand new to us, but also feels entirely consistent. And I do think part of that is just a willingness to use Batman that way, because Batman has, much to my shock, like if you just talk about the character of, or the base concept of Batman and look at him the last probably 25 years or so, you would not necessarily consider him that adaptable. But if you look at his entire publishing history, Batman is a character that should have been ruined by the Comics Code Authority. Comics Code Authority came along in the 50s and said, no more criminals getting away with stuff, no more criminals being hideous. The cops always have to be treated with respect. The hero has to win in the end. And you're looking at Batman, and whose roots are in the pulps, and especially in like the Dark Avenger pulps, like the Shadow or the Spider. He is a character that should have been kneecapped by that. But instead, everybody just went, okay, screw it. Batman just became a science fiction character. And against all odds, it works for like 20 years. And I feel like for whatever reason, that adaptability is now baked into the concept of Batman. And he is a really great lens through which to tell a story that instantly magnifies the scope of the universe. And I think we've seen that before when they introduced Ra's al Ghul. The same thing.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, Joshua. I was going to say that when you're thinking about the world building and also just how magical does Batman get, how does that universe get, they've already sort of set the table with Ra's al Ghul to have these supernatural, like there are things that are beyond the explainable that happen, right? So as an audience, we're already thinking, okay, so that's plausible. And this takes it a whole step further, yes, because they go deep in the sack for the crazy magic, the cats that turn into cat people, demons, and then when the demons extracted from the human body, the human ages rapidly, building like magical shields around. You know, this is the kind of magic you would think, oh, this is not a Batman story, but it works in spades. And also, I just want to go back to the fact that Batman just treats it like from the get-go, like, oh yeah, this is normal. Like they never really acknowledge how wild the magic is. It just happens and they roll with it, you know? And I think that's a great touch. I think what could have been a weakness of this episode had they not handled it effectively is actually its greatest strength.
That is a really good point. And I think the unflappability of Bruce Wayne, both in and out of costume, is part of what allows us to go along on this. He knows Jason and he knows Etrigan, and they're known commodities. He's not really interested in sitting down with Tim and explaining all the ways that he came to know Jason, or all the ways that realizing King Arthur was real changed his worldview. Like we even get a just don't ask at the end, but he is willing to go, no, it's all real. It's all very dangerous. And we need to deal with this right now to the tune of either $1 million or let's go have a magic fight in the streets. You know, I do think that unflappability and that Batman is just willing to accept it is what allows us to go in and go, yeah, totally makes sense. Let's do this.
Well, and I like that you point out at the very end of the episode, it's almost a punchline. Robin's like, wow, well, what a night. And he says, just don't ask. Just don't ask. Just don't ask. Like don't try to explain. And I think really, and you and I don't actually know your particular perspective on this, but I think that magic in fiction, that's the way you do it. You just don't try to explain it, because if you try to explain magic, then you run into, it doesn't feel as whimsical, and or the fantasy's not quite there. Not saying there aren't rules, but I'm saying that when you try to over explain it, it sort of takes away what it adds to the story. And I really, again, they drew the line. I think they knew exactly what kind of sandbox they were playing in, knowing that they were adding a bunch of stuff, and just said, what is the most effective way to add magic without really blowing apart the audience's suspension of disbelief in a Batman story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like I said, I think it's the history of the character that made the creators on this episode feel confident that Batman could carry the weight. Because if you look at his entire history, he's been carrying that weight for a long time. It's pretty great.
Joshua, didn't he one time travel back to meet Christopher Columbus and sail the ocean blue? I'm pretty sure that's an actual Batman story that really happened sometime in the 60s or 70s. I don't quote me on the specifics, but I know that story exists.
I can go much more recently and tell you that during Grant Morrison's giant-sized multi-year opus of the character, that Bruce Wayne was presumed dead when he was actually just time traveling, and it was literally Batman versus history, and he was a caveman and a pirate and a cowboy, and then he went to the very end of time. Batman can do what he wants.
And then, ladies and gentlemen, all your arguments are rendered invalid every time, because he's Batman.
All right, Caleb, we admit that this is a really fun to watch episode, just chock full of great adventure tropes, but it's kind of fluffy. So it might be hard for us to make some alternative media recommendations, but you have two that I think make all the sense in the world and are really great. Please tell me, if people like this episode of New Batman Adventures, what else should they be watching or reading or experiencing?
Initially, I struggled because Arthurian film adaptations or television adaptations, usually pretty bad. I'm not saying there aren't great ones out there, because there are, just not very many of them, and not recently.
No, you're right. You're right. It's hard to come by.
Prince
the quality
Valiant,
is
trash.
tough.
The First Night, trash. King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, the one that came out a couple years ago, as much as I wanted to like it and I actually kind of enjoyed it, also a giant heaping pile of trash.
That's worth saying right here. Let's say that to our listeners. Just because we say something is trash doesn't mean that we didn't watch it and enjoy it and will watch it again. I have many films that I think are absolute garbage that I still enjoy, and that's okay. It's only when you start trying to make the argument that your enjoyment equals quality that you start to get onto dodgy territory.
100%. But you know, Joshua, I did find one that I think is related enough. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I have to say Sam Raimi's, the third part of his Evil Dead trilogy, Army of Darkness, because I think this one is both good and lots of fun. And it's good because it knows what it is and fully embraces what it is, which is a pulpy, silly B action movie set in the medieval times where there is the Arthurian type magic. And it stars Bruce Campbell, who is one of the most charming actors of my lifetime that I can speak to. I mean, just the guy can, especially when you set him in a B movie environment, A++. Can't recommend it enough if you haven't seen it. Army of Darkness, check it out.
Army of Darkness is actually how I was introduced to Bruce Campbell and why I fell in love with him and have watched everything he's ever been in, I think. He really is like the special sauce that elevates things, because he knows exactly what he's doing and why he's doing it. He's there to have a good time and to be extremely charming while he's at it. I'll also point out to you that I think you're on to another aspect of why Army of Darkness is a great choice from this episode, which is if you compare Army of Darkness, which is technically the third installment in Raimi's Evil Dead series, to the first two installments, it could not be more different. Like, you've stepped into a different but related world with Army of Darkness, and I think that's what Jason Blood and Clarion do for Batman here. That's an inspired choice, I think.
It's definitely like genre meshing to the extreme, and genre meshing in a way that leads to something that feels altogether different than the thing it's meshing together, which I think is, again, part of the strength. The other recommendation I'd throw out there is a recent Arthurian legend adaptation that I actually did quite enjoy, and it's last year's Joe Cornish film, The Kid Who Would Be King. It's not great. It's made for kids, but it's really fun. And when I say made for kids, like there's sometimes you watch movies and you're like, okay, kids can enjoy it. But also clearly made for adults. This one definitely skews more towards kids, but I still, being an inner child, really enjoyed a lot about it. I did think the way they worked Arthurian lore into some of the creative choices that they made the film, lots of fun. I mean, your main cast are like 10-year-olds, so again, keep that in mind. Definitely a good one for the family. But I'll be honest, in terms of Arthurian adaptations, looking back over the last 10, 15 years, I'm like, yikes, there really aren't very many good ones. So The Kid Who Would Be King, that has my recommendation. Check it out. Joshua, how about you?
I am going to make comic book recommendations right now because I figured that most of our listeners kind of fall into the same camp as yourself, where these are interesting characters you'd like to know more about, but you have no idea where to go in the comics to do that. One of these recommendations is going to require more reading than you might think. Clarion the Witch Boy actually had a series written by Grant Morrison that went for exactly 4 issues, which sounds bad. Except that's the number of issues it was supposed to go, because it was part of a much larger experiment. And the much larger experiment is called The 7 Soldiers of Victory. The 7 Soldiers of Victory is a 30-issue story that is told with 2 bookends and then 7 4-issue miniseries. So each one of the miniseries focuses on one of the 7 soldiers, and the 7 soldiers are a team of superheroes who never actually meet, even though they eventually defeat the world-ending cataclysm that's breathing down their necks. And one of those, I use the term very loosely, heroes is Clarion the Witch Boy, and his series is delightful. But it honestly might not make as much sense as you want it to unless you're... I think it works on its own, but I would also highly recommend the entire 7 Soldiers project. The other one I'm going to recommend is to look at The Demon, right? Because that's the other one where you're like, where do I start? Do I start in 1972? You absolutely can. Kirby stuff is great. If you have access to that, go read it. What might be a little easier to find and a little more fun, if you're of the mind that Etrigan can't necessarily carry an entire series by himself, you should check out Demon Knights. This is one of the few number of successes that came from the New 52 publishing launch in DC Comics. Demon Knights is basically, what if you had a Justice League back in medieval times? They don't call themselves the Justice League, okay, but I'm saying a team of super people in medieval times. It's spectacular. One of the main characters that holds the whole thing together is Etrigan. Another one is the Shining Knight, who is a character we won't get to talk to on this show for quite a while, but the Shining Knight was also one of the 7 soldiers who got a miniseries during Grant Morrison's experiment with them. So very good stuff. Would highly recommend Demon Knights.
That sounds right up my alley. I actually think I might go check out Demon Knights. So Joshua, thank you for that great recommendation.
That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I'm at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
Well, I'm the editor-in-chief and a contributor at the Cinematropolis, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. We publish in-depth essays on all types of films. You can also find our podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, there, or on your preferred podcast app, and you can find it all on the cinematropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/Pulp Diction Productions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are very easy to find in the show notes. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us for this animated discussion. We'll be back next time to talk about Blasts from the Pasts, parts 1 and 2 of Superman the Animated Series. Make sure it's plural, blasts, plural, from the past, part 1 and 2.
We'll see you back here, same bat time, same bat channel.